Hello and welcome to this week's edition of WION-VOA co-production. I'm your host, Susan Tehrani, coming to you live from New York City. We begin this week with a sea change in the U.S. position on the Ukraine war. As the Trump administration looks to broker an end to the Russia-Ukraine war, many Ukrainians are dealing with the reality of starting over after losing their homes. The United Nations says that 3.5 million Ukrainians are internally displaced. One project helps them find new homes and jobs while helping the development of small villages. Lucia Bakalets reports from the Kyiv region.
This cute doll is the only item of sentimental value that the Protasevich family managed to take when they fled Russian forces who invaded Ukraine in 2022.
We fled with 2 things: hidden laptops, 2 cans of gasoline, and my daughter brought this doll. Her name is Tuzia.
Katerina, her husband, mother, and 2 children are from a village in Ukraine's Kherson region. Displaced, they had to spend a year and a half moving through the country, trying to find a place to settle.
For many IDPs from villages or small communities, it's tough to assimilate to a big city. To acquire new skills when you have lost everything is extremely stressful.
To help families like Protasevich's, a group called the Enjoying Life Charitable Foundation created a project called House Nearby, aimed at making internally displaced people or IDPs comfortable in their new communities.
We buy houses, do basic repairs, so there are all the amenities, and give them free to a family that wants to move to the village in the Kyiv region and live and work there for at least 10 years. They have to take care of this house and pay utilities.
After 10 years, a family becomes the owner of the house. The fund also looks for job openings. Many towns and villages have labor shortages. This hospital in the town of Tarashcha in the Kyiv region has 10 vacancies.
We need a pediatrician, a general practitioner, a neurologist, and a functional diagnostics doctor. As a small hospital, it is hard to be attractive to specialists. But when a vacancy potentially comes with housing, it's different.
This one hospital serves 26,000 people from nearby small communities. With many workers of retirement age and young people moving to bigger cities, officials say IDPs can help fill the gap.
We've already had several interviews with internally displaced persons whom the foundation recommended.
For those displaced by war, the program is a chance at a stable home and community.
At first, I doubted whether it was worth moving again, because constant changes are exhausting. But after 4 months of living here, it felt like home. What I like most is that it is relatively safe here. My children sleep. You can't hear sirens.
Protasevich has been living in Medvin village in the Kyiv region for a year. Initially working as an accountant, now she is helping others like herself with the Enjoying Life Charitable Foundation.
They were looking for a social worker who would help families settle down and act as an intermediary between them and the fund.
While House Nearby is a pilot project, organizers want to scale up and teach communities how to implement such programs on their own. As expectations grow for the Russia-Ukraine war to end, so does hope for those who had to flee can once again have a place to call home. Lucia Bakalets, WION News in the Kyiv region of Ukraine.
All right, for more on this, we are now being joined by VOA's Jessica Stone. She's joining us from Washington, D.C. from the White House. Jessica, later this week will mark the 3rd anniversary of Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, but that's not what President Donald Trump said this week. What explains his comments, and how are they being received at this point?
Well, 2 questions there that are really rocking Washington. People are trying to figure out what's motivating his, not only his 180 on resolving the war, but whose side he appears to be on. Trump blaming Kyiv for starting the war. It's clear that Russia invaded Ukrainian territory. So arguably a question about that comment. Zelensky, meanwhile, saying Trump was being influenced by Russian disinformation. So clearly a war of words between these two leaders. Trump on social media then calling on Zelensky, calling him a dictator. And keep in mind, they did not hold elections in Ukraine because they were in the middle of a war. Vice President J.D. Vance has said this. He said Zelensky appears to be getting really bad advice on how to deal with the Trump administration because he's taking these comments public, and that anyone who knows Donald Trump knows that is not the way to engage with him. Trump clearly believes the war should end, and many Americans do too, that it has cost too many lives, too many American dollars. It is not clear, though, that this war of words is helpful to the negotiations at all. Of course, they're happening behind closed doors, and so it's also not clear that they might not have a purpose at this point.
And Secretary of State Marco Rubio held direct talks this week with his counterpart, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in Saudi Arabia. It's the first time in 3 years that such high-level talks have taken place. And the pair agreed to move forward or towards reestablishing diplomatic relations and selecting a negotiating team to bring an end to the Ukraine war. So what type of deal is taking shape at this point? Do we even know?
We don't have a lot of detail, but it seems clear a couple of things. Rubio said that concessions will have to be made by all sides, and many U.S. officials in this White House have said, look, it is not realistic for Ukraine to expect that it will be part of NATO or that it will become part of NATO. It is also not realistic, they say, for Ukraine to think that it is going to get all of the territory that has been taken by Russia back. The discussion has really moved to making a deal between the amount of territory returned and security guarantees. But the problem here is that Europe is not on the same page with itself about who will guarantee the peace, whether peacekeepers will be on the ground from Europe. U.S. President Donald Trump has said they will not come from the United States. And so Europe needs to be looking at ways to secure the peace as well. And that is really up in the air amongst the Europeans themselves. So far, talks have not taken place between all of these parties, Europe, the United States, Ukraine, and Russia.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Jessica, please do stay with us. We go to this story from your colleague about what the effects of Donald Trump's tariffs may be. Small businesses are waiting to feel the effect of President Donald Trump's executive order imposing a 25% tariff on imported steel and aluminum. The VOA's Michelle Quinn has the story.
It's canning day at Temescal Brewing in Oakland, California. Today, workers will pour craft beer into 6,000 aluminum cans. Next month, these cans will likely be more expensive. President Donald Trump recently signed an executive order raising tariffs on steel and aluminum. Imported aluminum will face a 25% tariff, up from Trump's 10% rate during his first term in office. Steel imports will also face a minimum 25% tariff, as Trump said he would no longer exempt any countries from his 2018 duties.
This is the beginning of making America rich again.
The Trump administration aims to boost U.S. manufacturing, particularly the U.S. steel and aluminum industries, which have struggled against cheaper imports. About a quarter of the steel used in the U.S. is imported, much of it from Canada and Mexico. The U.S. also imports about half its aluminum, mostly from Canada. But other industries are anticipating they will likely have to pay higher prices while domestic steel and aluminum production gets up to speed.
We could see a renaissance, if you will, for California and the U.S. Steel and aluminum industries, which would be a very good thing for our economy. The negative impacts are felt by everyone else.
Those could include increased costs that cut across many industries, he said.
Steel and aluminum are ubiquitous. They're everywhere. They're needed everywhere. Construction, building factories, just the impact. Cars is another good example. We need it in our everyday lives.
Here at Temescal Brewing, the focus is on getting beer canned and out. Over the past decade, craft beer, which used to be primarily delivered in glass bottles, shifted to aluminum cans, making breweries vulnerable to tariffs.
You know, for a lot of small places, it could be being open or closed due to, you know, tariff rising and everything. It's not something that we're stoked on.
This small brewery is part of a global trade ecosystem. Its malt comes from Canada, for example. The possibility of a bigger trade war worries its chief executive.
These things scare us because I think that we already are up against some significant headwinds, and now if we throw okay, suddenly our supply chain is going to get a lot more expensive, that just becomes an even bigger threat.
The U.S. tariffs on imported steel and aluminum are scheduled to go into effect on March 12th. Michelle Quinn, VOA News.
VOA's Jessica Stone is still live with us. Jessica, all of this is happening as inflation here in the United States, it's still not under control. Can you talk about that for us?
Sure, and of course that's something that Americans are still feeling keenly. We talk a lot about the price of eggs, as you well know, but if the price of these other goods goes up, it will not help the consumer price index, which of course rose 3% in January from a year ago. Housing prices are still rising, services are still expensive, unemployment is still low, which means people are still spending money, which is driving up prices as well. But we're just 30 days into the Trump presidency. We haven't seen the impact or the passage of any Trump tax cuts, or some of the other deregulation plans that he has announced. And the impact of those could well also bring down inflation. So we are still 30 days in, looking for that impact. But of course, everyone watching the impact of Trump, the tariffs, as well as other actions from this White House on the price of goods, because that's a huge part of how Americans vote and why they voted for this president.
And this time last week, we at WION were still trying to understand the impact of the Trump administration's proposed reciprocal tariffs. Ultimately, the government will study the issue and make recommendations to the president about what those tariffs should look like. Have we seen any impact in the market or the global economy, about these proposals themselves?
We actually are starting to see some protection being implemented by other governments that anticipate that these tariffs will hit their economies hard. First, the White House has signaled some key areas to watch in their own fact sheet. Ethanol from Brazil, agriculture and motorcycles from India, digital services from Europe, and autos from Europe. All of those noting that they could be impacted specifically by this concept of reciprocal tariffs. Analysts note that the administration does appear to be moving away from a model where they're going to tariff everything across the board reciprocally to some targeted tariffs. Now, who's reacting? South Korea has already just announced a $250 billion trade policy to support its exporters in the face of these tariffs. The EU is also engaging more stockpiling and production subsidies to cushion the blow. So we are seeing reaction already in the global economy. The first set of trade reports is due to this White House in April. That is the first opportunity that those impacted inside the United States will have to make the case to the White House that they should either have an exemption or a waiver, or that they will experience some pain as a cause or a result of these reciprocal tariffs. Susan?
Great. Thank you so much for all of that. VOA's Jessica Stone joining us live from the White House. Jessica, have a lovely weekend. For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.